So, there's this VTuber, Xion, trust me, this is relevant, that one time when she went on some random tangent, her chat said it's like she's going to Brazil. Hate to explain the joke, but this is because Japan and Brazil are on opposite sides of the globe, and so her random tangents that pop out of nowhere are like her suddenly going to Brazil. By the way, link to the Xion clip is in the description. Good stuff. And as it turns out, hundreds of thousands of Japanese did, for whatever reason, decide to move to Brazil, and today there are more than 2 million Japanese Brazilians in the country. In fact, Brazil actually has the largest population of Japanese outside of Japan. So, why did this happen? Between the late 1800s and early 1900s, coffee was the main export product of Brazil, and much of the industry was built upon the backs of slaves. The slave trade was abolished in Brazil in 1850, but it was only until May 13, 1888 that slavery was completely abolished nationwide. During this time, the Brazilian government wanted to whiten the country by increasing its population of ethnic Europeans, and Brazilian plantation owners wanted cheap labor. So the government and plantation owners offered to pay for the passage of European immigrants to Brazil to encourage them to work in the country. The immigrants were treated rather poorly, which forced Italy to enact the Decree Brinetti, which prohibited subsidized emigration to Brazil. In the year before the decree, close to 60,000 Italians immigrated to Brazil, but this number fell to around 13,000 after it was passed. Thus, again, Brazilian plantation owners needed to find a new source of cheap labor, and as it turns out, Japan was a perfect place to find new immigrants. After the abolition of the Han system in Japan in 1871, poverty was rampant in rural areas, which led to many Japanese to wish to emigrate to new areas in hopes of establishing a better life. The abolition of the Han system basically ended the feudal system in the country and centralized the government's authority in Japan. The industrialization that followed this period also led to a population boom, so many looked abroad for a new place to call home. This was the only possible now, as Japan had previously had an isolationist policy for centuries, which effectively meant no emigration out of Japan. But many Japanese could not emigrate to nations like the US, Australia, or Canada due to various discriminatory immigration acts which largely barred the entry of Japanese people among other groups. Nonetheless, in Japan, emigration companies were set up to bring Japanese to different parts of the world. These companies negotiated employment contracts, selected candidates, provided the means of transport, and were responsible for ensuring that contracts were respected. They also invested in advertising and promoted emigration as an opportunity for Japanese people to make tons of money. The Japanese government further supported such emigration efforts, including those to Brazil. In 1896, Japan passed the Immigrant Protection Act, which encouraged immigration and made it easier for Japanese to emigrate to other countries. Furthermore, thanks to the Brazilian Constitution of 1891, states were given the authority to manage their own immigration policies. This is why Sao Paulo and its coffee plantations became the center of immigration to Brazil during this time. In 1907, the government of the state of Sao Paulo started signing contracts with different Japanese immigration companies. The first official group of Japanese immigrants came to Brazil on the Kasato Maru. The trip began at the port of Kobe on April 28, 1908, and the ship traveled to Singapore, Cape Town, and finally to the port of Santos on June 18th of the same year. This was a city around 60 kilometers south of Sao Paulo. Most of the 781 people were rural farmers who signed contracts with the Empire Immigration Company. There were Japanese immigrants who came to Brazil before the Kasato Maru, and they established an agricultural colony in the state of Rio de Janeiro, but the immigrants aboard the Kasato Maru were the first officially documented immigrants. It's interesting to note that what J. Amancio Sobral, inspector of immigrants from the state of Sao Paulo, wrote in an article on the Japanese immigrants in the newspaper Correio Paulistano. He claimed that they were dressed in Western-style clothing and brought wicker suitcases, clothes, and objects. They all had toothbrushes, tooth powder, a comb, and a razor, which were items many European immigrants and even Brazilians did not have. If he believes everything in this article, it would appear as though many Japanese immigrants to Brazil were rather comfortable or had significant monetary support from immigration companies or the Japanese government itself. After this group of Japanese people arrived at the port of Santos, they went to coffee plantations around the city of Sao Paulo as specified under their contracts. From 1908 to 1915, close to 15,000 Japanese immigrated to Brazil, and this number increased after World War I. Between 1917 and 1941, around 190,000 Japanese emigrated to the country. These Japanese people largely emigrated to Brazil in hopes of gaining wealth and then returning to Japan after a few years abroad. However, this rarely occurred due to various factors. For one, the contracts signed between the Imperial Company of Immigration of Tokyo and the government of the state of Sao Paulo only permitted the immigration of families of 3 to 10 people over the age of 12 years old. Forcing people to immigrate with their families increased the number of mouths to feed and support, thus reducing the ability of people to get rich quickly and return to Japan. Japanese working on plantations were also paid quite poorly, worked long hours, and oftentimes truck wages would be employed. These were systems that basically meant that workers were paid with vouchers or credits which they could use to purchase necessities like food instead of real money. Thus, many Japanese left coffee plantations in search of finding new work. Of the 781 people that arrived in Brazil aboard the Kasato Maru, only 359 were still working on coffee plantations by the end of 1908. Starting in 1910, Japanese immigration companies started buying large areas of land to operate like colonies. The companies would sell lots of land to Japanese immigrants and aid them in starting to produce rice, cotton, and raw materials related to the textile industry. In these isolated communities of almost exclusively Japanese Brazilians, children went to school in Japanese, learned about Japanese culture, and Japanese newspapers were created. The Japanese government and the immigration companies also manufactured equipment for Japanese immigrants and provided them with good infrastructure. Many efforts were made to make the Japanese communities in Brazil as similar to the mother country as possible, as there was a belief among many at the time in Japanese racial superiority, particularly among the ruling class. In 1917, after the Sao Paulo government cut and then granted subsidies to Japanese immigration again, the government of Japan founded the Kaigai Kogyo Kabushiki Kaisha, the Overseas Development Corporation, which was a merger of various immigration companies and effectively established a monopoly over such practices. From 1924 to 1942, tickets were also fully subsidized by the Japanese government, which further encouraged immigration to Brazil. By the 1930s, Brazil already had the world's largest community of Japanese outside of Japan, a title which it still holds to this day. However, during this time, many Brazilians, especially many in the government, shunned the independent Japanese communities. The Immigration Act of 1938 made it mandatory for all non-naturalized foreigners under the age of 60 to be registered, introduced a foreigner's card, and set the Japanese entry quota at 2% of all the Japanese that immigrated to Brazil in the last 50 years. Decree Law No. 383, passed on April 18, 1938, prohibited the participation of foreigners in political activities, and in August, the teaching of foreign languages was prohibited in the country. In 1939, the publication of foreign language newspapers was also banned, and it became punishable offense to speak a language other than Portuguese in churches, community associations, or even in one's home. The issue became even more severe during World War II, when the two countries were fighting on opposite sides of the conflict. The last group of Japanese immigrants during World War II would arrive in Brazil aboard the Buenos Aires Maru in 1941. Brazil officially severed all relations with Japan on January 29, 1942, and Getulio Vargas, the president of Brazil at the time, instituted various discriminatory policies aimed at Japanese Brazilians. During this time, Japanese Brazilians were not permitted to travel within the country without police permission. Over 200 Japanese schools were closed, and radio equipment was seized to prevent communication with outside forces. Many Japanese companies also had their goods seized, and thousands of Japanese Brazilians were arrested or expelled from the country on suspicion of espionage. Furthermore, on July 10, 1943, close to 10,000 Japanese, German, and Italian immigrants who lived in Santos were given 24 hours to move away from the Brazilian coast and close their businesses. Around 90% of these displaced peoples were Japanese. Although this does not relate too much to the topic of immigration, after the war, two major factions emerged in the Japanese-Brazilian community. One of these groups was the Kachikumi, who, due to the presence of misinformation, believed that Japan had won the war, and they opposed the Makegumi, who believed that Japan had lost the war. The Shindo Renmei was established by those who believed that Japan won the war, and this was a terrorist organization that was involved in the killing of 23 and wounding of 147. All of their victims were Japanese Brazilians. After the war's end, anti-Japanese racism was still present in Brazil. During the National Constituent Assembly of August 27, 1946, Miguel Couto Filho, representative of Rio de Janeiro, proposed an amendment to the Constitution which stated it prohibited the entry of Japanese immigrants of any age and any origin in the country. 99 representatives voted in favor of this amendment, and 99 voted against it. It was only thanks to Senator Fernando de Melo Viana being chair of the Assembly, a role which is given an extra vote to break ties, that the amendment was ultimately rejected. But it goes to show that Brazil was this close to halting all immigration of Japanese people to the country purely on the basis of race. Nonetheless, by the time of World War II's end, Japanese Brazilian families commonly had the eldest son take over his father's business, speak Japanese, and remain immersed in Japanese cultural norms and ways of life. Meanwhile, the younger children went to university, spoke Portuguese, and were often baptized by their parents Roman Catholic. It was also during this time that many legitimately considered permanently settling in Brazil, and the idea of Niseis was born, second-generation Japanese immigrants. From 1953 to 1973, around 55,000 Japanese immigrated to Brazil, and this was the last major wave of Japanese immigration to the country. It was also in the late 1960s that the Japanese government stopped actively encouraging people to emigrate from the country. Furthermore, in the 1980s, only around 25% of Japanese Brazilians and their descendants practice a traditional Japanese religion such as Shintoism or Buddhism, while close to 66% of Japanese Brazilians identified as Roman Catholic. Also in the 1980s, Japan was starting to face a shortage of low-skilled labor, so it actively encouraged Japanese Brazilians to come to Japan, and Brazil was also experiencing an economic crisis during this time. But many Japanese Brazilians who went to work in Japan later returned to Brazil due to various factors such as cultural alienation, lack of Japanese proficiency, and the possibility of finding better jobs. Although in 2008, 100 years since the first ship carrying Japanese immigrants arrived in Brazil, more than 310 Brazilian citizens were living in Japan. Today it is believed that nearly 2 million people in Brazil have some Japanese ancestry, and close to two-thirds of them live in the state of Sao Paulo. Many Japanese Brazilians choose to live in the neighborhood of Liberdade in Sao Paulo in particular. So today, just by looking at the streets of this neighborhood, the Japanese influence on this area is extremely apparent. But that's largely the story of Brazil, a country of people whose backgrounds come from all over the world. Interestingly, there are estimated to be around 7 million people of Lebanese descent in Brazil, more than the country of Lebanon. But that's a topic that deserves a video of its own. Still, the story of Japanese immigration to Brazil is unlike any other between two countries on opposite sides of the globe. Today, there are various festivals and celebrations that take place in Brazil celebrating Japanese culture and its Japanese Brazilian population. And today, unlike so many Japanese Brazilians in the past, they no longer work to return to Japan one day, as they are Brazilians just like all others in their beautiful country. And yeah, that's the end of the video. Honestly surprised that there was this much to talk about, but it was genuinely interesting, and I hope you guys enjoyed it too. I just remember how all my last couple of videos had VTuber references in them. Might honestly make some VTuber specific content in the future, but I don't know. I'll see. But yeah, either way, thank you all so much for watching.